So, welcome back to Coleslaw of My Consciousness. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about Ray Bradbury. I pretty much like to think of him as my muse. Basically, anytime I read anything by him, I just feel so inspired to write. He's pretty much a surefire way to get me in the mood to do writing and things like that. And recently I actually discovered that he had a TV show called the Ray Bradbury Theater, where all of the episodes are basically like some of his short stories that have then been turned into screenplays. All the writing, as far as I can tell, and as far as the show says, was done by him, and all of that. I've been watching several episodes of this now and really enjoying it, and it's having the same effect watching it as it does when I read Ray Bradbury. So I wanted to try and do one of these little voice pieces that was somewhat inspired by Ray Bradbury because of that. So without further ado, that's what I'm going to try and do for this next episode of Coleslaw of My Consciousness. I hope you guys enjoy. Of course, leave your comments and opinions, all that below. And have a great day. I'll get started in just a few moments. She'd always liked gardenias. What wonderful colors they had. And now here she was getting married with one in her hair. It felt fitting, and morbid her mind flashed to a day hopefully far in the future, when she'd one day be in a grave, and hopefully someone would think to rest a gardenia in her hair then as well. She laughed after a moment. Death on the day of her wedding. What silly thoughts. What was she doing thinking of such things? She continued to brush her hair gently, just the loose little bits that hung down around the beautiful gardenia that hung there. She still couldn't believe it was today. She'd never thought she'd be one to be married. It seemed like something that would happen to someone else, to many someone else's, but never to her. It wasn't the sort of thing that she felt prepared for, even now, even with the person that she wanted to be with. It seemed such a strange idea that she'd actually reached this point where it was that she would be married. She dreamed of this day, of course. Most girls did. But to think that she had actually arrived at this day after such a life of such sadness, of such disappointment, of days like lightning bolts striking all the happiness from her so many times. It amazed her. She hoped that the happiness of this day would last, unlike the other happinesses that had been ripped so slowly in those bolts from her life. She knew perhaps that was too much to hope for. There were many out there who had sad lives. There were many out there who had happy lives. But always the luck of the draw was a complete mystery. No one could determine just by a guess if they would be the ones who would have that happiness, or if they would have that sadness. She wondered for a brief moment if perhaps the morbidity of thinking of her own death on her wedding day was just part of her luck, or if that was her brain trying to adjust to a happiness that was so unique. She paused, trying to shake the thoughts from her head. Today was supposed to be happy. Just think of the wedding. Think of that happiness. Carefully and resolutely, she set down her brush. It was time to think of other things. It was time to go to stand before an altar and to be bound to the man that she wanted to be with. She stood firmly, once again, resolutely, keeping her thoughts on the happiness of the moment. Idly, her hand went one last moment to the gardenia in her hair. She smiled at her reflection. Seeing that flower there made her so happy. Today made her so happy. She turned from the mirror and headed out of the room. It was time to go to this wedding. It was time to be joined in holy matrimony. She was going to put all other thoughts from her head and think only of this happy occasion. She walked down the hall, very solemnly, thinking as much as she could of happiness, but thoughts of other things intruding as they would, for thoughts were not easy to contain, even on this day that should have been one of her happiest moments. She fought off the feeling as best she could, and waited in front of the doors that would lead into the chapel. In a moment, she would go through them. But first, the music had to change. Right now, it almost sounded of a dirge, slow and steady, but not the march of the wedding that she was expecting. She paused and waited, listening for a very long time. Too long, it seemed. They should have known that she was only moments away from arrival. She'd only been briefly adjusting herself before coming down. She'd told the bridesmaids that she was on her way. Why was the march not playing? Why hadn't they switched to it? She swallowed, took a deep breath. With or without the march, maybe she just needed to see this thing through. Maybe she needed to peer inside of that chapel, encourage them to switch over to the march by her very presence. She was the bride after all. Perhaps that was all they were waiting for, was the bride to come marching down the aisle. After all, it wasn't as if she had a father who could walk her down, so they had no other way of knowing if she was standing behind those doors ready for the signal of them to play that march. Firmly, resolutely, she put her hands on the door and pushed them open wide. There were indeed people gathered in that chapel, but it was not the crowd that she expected, not the bright, cheerful happiness that she was expecting from her wedding day. It did appear that her groom was standing at the end of the aisle, standing by that altar, that there was a priest there. But something felt muted about this. The music did change, but it stayed slow. A dirge in the form of the wedding march. She didn't want to walk down the aisle anymore, not with that music playing. What was going on? Why had this happened? Why was this her wedding day? Where was the bright happiness that was supposed to be happening? But not knowing what else to do, she made up her mind. Listening to the dirge-like wedding march, she began her march down the aisle towards the man she planned to marry. She tried to keep a smile on her face, but it was hesitant, and she knew that to those watching in the seats that she did not look as happy as a bride ought to look on her wedding day. But still she continued down, keeping her eyes instead on the man that she was to marry. Rather than on the crowds around her, rather than on the music, she tried to focus on him, on his face, which was watching her. He looked firm and resolute. A smile almost played across his lips as well, but he seemed to sense the strangeness, just as she did. His smile was almost a frown, as confused as she felt. Finally, she stood beside him. They stared at each other, stood across from the aisle, then at the direction from their clergyman. They knelt across the altar from each other. He spoke words, but she doubted that her soon-to-be husband heard them any more than she did. The tone of everything still felt so strange, so off. But the ceremony continued, and was eventually completed. They were married. They stood and hugged happily and kissed happily, then firmly, resolutely turned to face the crowd before them, to see the strange mixture of sadness and half-pleasures on their faces. She squeezed the hand of her husband tightly. She didn't know what was going to happen now, why their wedding had turned out to be such a disastrous level of unhappiness. But she knew that she at least had him at her side, that he hadn't given up on her, and that somehow, even on this now unhappiest of days, they could find happiness together if they only tried. She squeezed his hand once more. He squeezed hers back in return, gave her a tight-lipped smile, and then together they walked down the aisle. Alright, so that was an even more truer sense than the first episode that I did. Me just reading off an idea. I had about 3 sentences to start that off, and then just trying to write as I spoke, which was the idea that I mentioned in the first episode of how we can try writing from that book, Writing Down the Bones. And so hopefully it didn't turn out too bad. It did kind of take on a stranger tone than I was expecting, but again, I've been watching some Ray Bradbury theater, and he's kind of like my muse, and I think the prompt that I'd written for myself ended up taking on a little bit of a surreal Ray Bradbury-ness to it that wasn't necessarily what I intended, but there you go. That's how things go sometimes. So again, feel free to leave comments about this, any ideas of things that you think could or should be changed, all that sort of thing. I'm excited to hear what kind of criticisms come from this, especially since it was pretty much me being like, I have a couple sentences and then we're gonna write a story to it. So yeah, let me know what you think and have a great rest of your day. I'll see you in the next episode.